Hello everyone, and welcome back to Isaiah from Mormons. Today we're going to be doing Isaiah chapter 19. So you'll remember last time we had 17 and 18, and those were one coherent chapter about specifically the Syrians and Israel's neighbors in general, I think, and talking about people from way down in kind of the Horn of Africa area, what is now Somalia, and those guys going even farther down into places like sort of Kenya and that area, bringing everybody up to go and attack Israel, and eventually them sort of inheriting what Israel would inherit, if they did not repent. So that's what we're getting here a little bit with chapter 19. We're getting something kind of similar to that. The theme of God brings the enemies in upon uh, these nations that aren't repenting, and the enemies come in and destroy everything. And but then God will, and at first God doesn't do anything. He just sits by and watches. We saw that. He says, I'm going to consider from my dwelling place. I'm just going to stand here and watch, because unfortunately that's just what I have to do right now, because you guys need to figure this out, and I can't protect you if you don't do the things you're supposed to do. So, but then of course he eventually does reach out his hand and sort of bring them back in and protect them again, and that's, I think, what we see here in 19 as well. This is once again a reminder. In some ways, it is one big trial. All of these chapters where he roasts these other nations are almost trials against the other gods. People will say, well, that's something that's later, that's an innovation that comes in after the Babylonian captivity. There was not monotheism back then. And I go, well, yes and no. Babylonian captivity strengthens this idea, and so we do see a lot more of that kind of thing. But what we see here is fairly consistent with what we see in the rest of the Old Testament. Jehovah is the best. These other gods are so worthless that they can't help anybody with anything. So it's Jehovah or nothing. Now people will sort of redefine what they consider to be a god, and during a certain period in Israelite history, and then they say, well, no, there aren't even any other gods at all except Jehovah. And that really honestly depends on your definition of what is a god. And so their definition goes from, well, their definition just becomes a bigger definition. They see, no, there's only one God. He's the one that made everything. He's the one that does everything, rather than kind of elevating what we might call demons, honestly, to God status. That's very old school of me to say that, but I can't help but wonder if that isn't what we're looking at during certain periods in the Old Testament. That they're seeing these really crazy things that happen, and they do indeed happen, because of occult things, and they attribute it to some kind of a. They consider this, sort of occult experience that does indeed come from real demons. We in the church have experience with this kind of thing. Unfortunately, we know that this really happens, and so many people have thought that they sort of elevate these people to the level of gods, and that doesn't seem outside the realm of possibility for me. So you have these, like I said, what we might call demons, elevated to the level of deities, but then eventually people say they start to take Isaiah's rhetoric through to its final conclusion, not just, well, these guys are puny and worthless gods, and Jehovah can beat them up every time, and they can't protect their people, and they're kind of these worthless gods, which is what you get for a lot of the Old Testament. Until finally, after the Babylonian captivity, they say, these gods are so worthless, they're not even gods at all. And that's, the position that I think we would take today. We wouldn't even call them deities. We would just call them demons, probably. And like I said, that's kind of an old school view of me, but I think that there's enough information between our own dispensation and the Old Testament, and frankly the New Testament too, to say that with a reasonable level of confidence, honestly, that we are looking at something like that. And so, but during this period, Isaiah is going through and systematically showing how worthless all these different deities are. So in 17 and 18, we saw a little bit of that about these other nations coming in and destroying um, Israel's neighbors because they were just kind of worthless. But here we see the same thing happening in Egypt, which is very interesting. You'll remember, of course, the Israelites came out of Egypt, um, and then the reason they came out is that God sort of beat them up in battle, and the Israelites were able to go free. The language in Exodus, actually, there's a lot of very military language in Exodus, because that really is the idea. God beat them in battle. And here that's kind of what we're seeing in 19. Um, but instead of the Assyrians being brought in on Egypt, although the Assyrians will be brought in on Egypt eventually, it's another group being brought in upon Egypt, the Nubians. So we're going to talk about that a little bit today and see how this happened and what happens to Egypt and what Isaiah is talking about here. This is some fairly new information, actually. When you look at a lot of the older books, they don't talk about this because I don't think they really understood at the time. We have a lot more archaeological evidence from this period now to help to fill in gaps that I don't think others really considered. So we'll just jump right into it here. So in 19:1 it reads, "The burden of Egypt. Behold, the Lord rideth upon a swift cloud, and shall come into Egypt, and the idols of Egypt shall be moved at his presence, and the heart of Egypt shall melt in the midst of it. And I will set the Egyptians against the Egyptians, and they shall fight every one against his brother, and every one against his neighbor, city against city, and kingdom against kingdom. And the spirit of Egypt shall fail in the midst thereof, and I will destroy the counsel thereof. And they shall seek to the idols, and to the charmers, and to them that have familiar spirits, and to the wizards. And the Egyptians will I give over into the hand of a cruel Lord. And a fierce king shall rule over them, saith the Lord of hosts. And the waters shall fail from the sea, and the rivers shall be wasted and dried up. And they shall turn the rivers far away, and the brooks of defense shall be emptied and dried up. The reeds and the flags shall wither. The paper reeds by the brooks, by the mouth of the brooks, and everything sown by the brooks shall wither, be driven away, and be no more. The fishers also shall mourn, and all they that cast angle into the brooks shall lament, and they that spread nets upon the water shall languish. Moreover, they that work in fine flax, and they that weave network shall be confounded, and they shall be broken in the purposes thereof, all that make sluices and ponds for fish." Now this, like I said, a lot of people didn't really know what was going on here. But for us, it's very clear. This is the beginning, chapter 19, the beginning of a new roasting against one of the nations. This is Egypt, the burden of Egypt, right? So that's how he always introduces which nation he's going to kind of go after next. But then right off the bat, we have something very interesting, something that appears in the Psalms. This idea that Jehovah is a war god. Now we get this from the oldest parts of the Old Testament, the Psalms, for example, many of the Psalms, Exodus 15, which is one of the oldest parts of the Old Testament, seems to have escaped much of the editing that happened to the Law of Moses, which we of course know about from the Book of Moses itself. But analysis of the style and age of that section does seem to indicate that that song has more or less escaped the ravages of editors. So we can see another very small, very old piece of the Law of Moses there. And in these cases, we see this image of God very often riding upon a swift cloud. Sometimes it refers to it almost like a chariot. In some of the Psalms, we get this image of God riding upon this cloudy chariot and sort of raining destruction down on Israel's enemies. And in fact, this was very often the idea in the ancient Near East, is that God would ride on this cloud chariot, and that's why you had to have high temples for him, because he would, on his way across the sky, he'd pop in into the top of the temple, right, and then go on to the next one. And so That's probably what we're looking at here. But there's a lot more to it than just that, I think. So definitely it depicts him as a warrior deity here. But you also have to remember it was a cloud that led the Israelites through the wilderness when they were going out of Egypt. So him sort of reassuming this form, sort of riding upon the swift cloud to go back into Egypt to hit them one more time, is a very interesting image. Once again, there's this probably would have been kind of funny to Isaiah's audience in kind of maybe a disturbing sort of way. But he makes these little jokes, these little jabs at the Egyptians. So funny and yet also a little bit disturbing. And we'll see that quite a bit in the book of Isaiah. And this is one of those times. He's kind of making fun of them, right? Behold, the Lord rideth upon a swift cloud, and shall come into Egypt, and the idols of Egypt shall be moved at his presence. So the idols, who obviously are always standing there perfectly, you have all, I'm sure, seen images of that, these sort of very stoic idols standing there that you get from ancient Egypt. Well, they'll be shaking. These idols who aren't supposed to do anything. Well, yeah, the only thing they're good for is shaking in their boots when Jehovah comes to attack them, right? So there's a little bit of comedy here. And the heart of Egypt shall melt in the midst of it. Um, and this is an idiom meaning they'll be really scared, but I mean, it's a fantastic image that their hearts will melt, right? They're just so afraid. And I will set the Egyptians against the Egyptians. Now, this is the key to what happened. Let me explain how this happened. So, Egypt, for many years, was just ruled by the native Egyptians, people that had been there for forever. Um, and they were sort of just your average Mediterranean kind of people, probably. We have some indication actually that Ramses II had red hair, and it's not it looks red, but most of us just assumed, well, it looks red because he's a mummy, he's been dead for who knows how long. Well, we tested his hair, and indeed, we can just tell by the chemicals in the hair that he was a redhead. So we think of Egyptians as looking much like we would think of your sort of run-of-the-mill sub-Saharan African today. But for much of its history, that was not the case. They probably would have looked perhaps like someone from Italy, maybe something like that, or some parts of the Middle East. Um, so not exactly quite as dark as maybe we would think of them. But during this period, there were these guys that came down from the south called Nubians. So their kingdom was called the Kingdom of Kush. It was sort of this mix of Egyptian stuff with some native Nubian stuff, way down south in the area that is sort of partly the Sudan area today. So they come up from the south and they attack Egypt. But they had been part of Egypt for a while before. So these Nubians come up from the south and attack the north. So literally it says, and I will set the Egyptians against the Egyptians, because that's exactly what happened. And they shall fight everyone against his brother and everyone against his neighbor, city against city, and kingdom against kingdom. So the kingdom of Cush versus the kingdom of Egypt. But every time you have a civil war like this, people kind of take sides. And so this really was an honest-to-goodness civil war to a great extent. And it says, and the spirit of Egypt shall fail in the midst thereof, and I will destroy the counsel thereof. They shall seek to the idols and to the charmers and to them that have familiar spirits and to the wizards. So, as things begin to fall apart, it says the spirit of Egypt shall fail in the midst thereof. Similar to the image we see before, their hearts will faint. They'll be just so terrified, and they'll realize that their happy little kingdom they thought they had is falling apart at the seams. And it says, I'll destroy the counsel thereof, which is to say, all the advice, we get this later on, all these advisors are coming, and they're telling the Pharaoh what to do, and everything always seems to go just fine. Well, suddenly, all that's going to fly to pieces. So they're going to try to get help from the idols, and from the necromancers, and from everybody else, and it's just not going to work. And it says, "And the Egyptians will I give into the hand of a cruel lord," and these specifically are the Nubians. "And a fierce king shall rule over them, saith the Lord of hosts." So these Nubians come up, and they are not exactly nice to the people in northern Egypt. So they're from southern Egypt, and they come up and they take out the northern half of Egypt. Egypt often is divided into upper and lower uh, pieces. Upper Egypt is not what we would think it is. Upper Egypt is actually upriver, so it's south. And Lower Egypt is downriver, near the mouth of the Nile, so it's actually north. So it's the exact opposite of what you would think. But very often they do divide um, into pieces. But this is one period where the south has conquered the north, and so it's united again, and is a very big kingdom going all the way down into Sudan. But when these guys from the south come up into the north, it says that he's a cruel lord and a fierce king. Well, he's not exactly nice to the northerners who he conquers. It says, "And the waters shall fail from the sea, and the rivers shall be wasted up and dried. And they shall turn the rivers far away, and the brooks of defense shall be emptied and dried up." Um, there's some clarification with some of these sections in the Septuagint. It's a little bit harsher, actually, surprisingly. It depicts the Egyptians going to get water, but there's none left, and so they tried to drink seawater, and obviously you can't. So it shows this sort of extreme desperation on the part of the Egyptians. Very, very kind of disturbing image. Um, but really, um, during this period, this actually happens in two ways. Number one, the Nubians don't care as much about the north. They conquer it to kind of get them off their back, but they focus a lot on their own area to a great extent. They do stuff in the north, but they focus more on their own area, and so they administer Lower Egypt, Northern Egypt, which is also lower. Remember, Lower Egypt is Northern Egypt. They run it like an occupied enemy territory, right? And so they are very brutal, these people, and there aren't a lot of projects, irrigation projects, the canals, because of all the silt from the Nile, which is one of the reasons the Nile is so fantastic, because it brings in good topsoil. These start to silt up all the canals and stuff like that, and it just becomes um, not as useful and productive. So really, the water becomes shallow, right? The river shall be wasted and dried up. Um, so that's one way that happens. But another way that it happens is we often think of global warming as being a modern sort of man-made phenomenon, and we definitely have messed with the environment. There's no question about that. But global warming and cooling has happened indefinitely, um, for forever, and they have a really good documentation from Greenland to show that this is the case. The Earth warms up and cools down, and warms up and cools down, and warms up and cools down. Right now, we are actually much hotter, and some people are saying, well, we really should never have gotten this hot. We may have really messed something up, and that is a possibility. Um, but during this period, there was a spike. Um, it was pretty hot, and then it cooled down a fair bit, and then there's a spike again during this period where it warms up quite a bit, and it seems very likely to me that during this period, during this warm spike, which happens right around this period, that you really did start to have problems like this. The Nile was very consistent. I mean, you could almost set your clock to the Nile practically as far as when and a lot of times how much it was going to flood. Very consistent, flooded every year, um, and bring topsoil in. Well, if it gets really hot and there's less rain down in Ethiopia, which is part of the area um, where the water flows into the Nile, and even actually farther south into Africa, if there isn't as much water, you aren't going to have as much water there in Egypt. So there are man-made problems in northern Egypt, but there are also real environmental problems probably during this period. Um, and so the waters don't even make it to the sea, it says, and the river shall be wasted and dried up. Um, and they shall turn the rivers far away. So people are desperately trying to get as much water as they can, so they have to keep going farther and farther upstream to get water out for irrigation. So they turn the rivers far away, it says. And the brooks of defense shall be emptied and dried up. The reeds and flags shall wither. Brooks of defense may be something like moats that they may have used sometimes to defend certain regions. But those will be worthless, it says. Number one, they'll probably be silted up, but number two, um, everything will be dry. The reeds and flags will wither. Remember that papyrus specifically was a major thing that they would use for writing on. That's some of the earliest papers made out of this papyrus reed, something like paper anyway. And also they would use it for making baskets and for all these other things. Well, suddenly this major agricultural product will wither. The paper reeds by the brooks, and that's what that are paper reeds and papyrus thing that make a sort of paper out of it. The paper reeds by the brooks, by the mouth of the brooks, and everything sown by the brooks shall wither, be driven away, and be no more. All of the agricultural product that they've been growing, and that's kind of what Egypt is founded on, is agriculture. All of this is going to dry up and blow away. That is what we would say there. The fishers also shall mourn, and all they that cast angle into the brook shall lament, and they that spread nets upon the waters shall languish. They're going to be trying to cast these nets, but there's no water, and so there's no fish. Moreover, they that work in fine flax, and they that weave network shall be confounded. And that may once again be an allusion to fishing. They used to make, actually, fishing nets, very kind of fine fishing nets. So they that weave networks is probably that. They that make fine flax. So also they would make linen. That was one of the other major things they grew. They would grow flax and then turn that into linen as one of the major agricultural products coming out of Egypt. They said these people that do this stuff, people that are making all these products, they're going to be out of luck. And they shall be broken in the purposes thereof, all they that make sluices and ponds for fish. So suddenly, all of Egypt's industry is just going to dry up, literally and figuratively. And that's really a terrifying image. It's almost like the plagues 2.0, right? That the first time God comes in and he specifically just keeps hitting Egypt over and over and over and over again. But this time he says, you know what? I'm just going to go straight for the jugular, dry up the Nile, and watch you guys shrivel up and blow away. Much akin, really, to what we got in during Joseph's time, right? The agriculture starts to go really bad, but this time there will not be a Joseph to save them. So this is a very kind of disturbing image for Egypt, and it does look like, when you look at the Nubian conquest and also the climate sort of calendar for this period, that does appear to be exactly what happened. So then he continues, surely the princes of Zon are fools, and the counsel of the wise counselors of Pharaoh is become brutish. How say ye unto Pharaoh, I am the son of the wise, the son of ancient kings? Where are they? Where are thy wise men? Let them tell thee now, let them know what the Lord of hosts hath purposed upon Egypt. The princes of Zon are become fools, the princes of Naph are deceived. They have also seduced Egypt, even they that are the stay of the tribes thereof. The Lord hath mingled a perverse spirit in the midst thereof, and they have caused Egypt to err in every work thereof, as a drunken man staggereth in his vomit. Neither shall there be any work for Egypt which the head or tail, branch or rush may do. In that day will Egypt be like unto a woman, and it shall be afraid and fear because of the shaking of the hand of the Lord of hosts, which he shaketh over it. And the land of Judah shall be a terror unto Egypt. Every one that maketh mention thereof shall be afraid in himself, because of the counsel of the Lord of hosts, which he hath determined against it. This section is interesting because we see an obvious addition by the third editor. Something we can tell actually really just because of the Book of Mormon. We'll get to that in just a second. But here in verse 11 it says, "Surely the princes of Zon are fools." So where is Zon? This appears to be on kind of the northern, sort of northeastern coast of Egypt. This is probably, this might be Tanis today. Um, it's a place like that. But the idea is this is in Lower Egypt, the northern part of Egypt. This is the area that was conquered by the Nubians. So the Nubians come up, and as the Nubians are on their way, these people in Zone in northern Egypt that used to be advisors to Pharaoh, suddenly all their advice is totally worthless. And Isaiah is definitely making fun of them, right? Surely the princes of Zone are fools. The counsel of the wise counselors of Pharaoh has become brutish. All these guys that thought they were so smart suddenly are realizing that they were stupid. They made all these projections about how great Egypt was going to do, and then suddenly everything went terrible for them. And so he says, "How can you say to Pharaoh, 'Oh, I'm the son of the wise. I'm the son of ancient kings'?" The Septuagint there clarifies that it's probably, I'm the son of the wise. I've counselors, advisors to the Pharaoh have been in my family for generations. Of course, I'm always going to do it right. That's the implication you get from the Septuagint. And he says, "Well, where are they now? Where are thy wise men? Let them tell thee now, and let them know what the Lord of hosts hath purposed upon Egypt." You guys think you can tell the future? Why don't you say what Jehovah is going to do to you guys? And obviously, they can't. But Isaiah is, right? So, this is actually pretty funny. He really is just totally roasting these guys. I wouldn't want to go up against Isaiah during Festivus. It says, "The princes of Zon are become fools. The prince of Noph are deceived." Now, Noph there, Zon we already talked about, probably Tanis. Noph is probably Memphis. It's hard to say, but either way, it was the capital at the time. It was the capital of Upper Egypt. And so the royalty in the capital of Upper Egypt are deceived. And it says, "They have also seduced Egypt, even they that are the stay of the tribes thereof." That's interesting to me that he would use the word seduced. But really this idea of lulling them into a sense of security. Right? They've told them all these things are going to work out great. But then the stay of the tribes thereof, really I would probably say the foundation of the people. Because you have all these, at the time you have all these little, not quite city-states, but these little groups. They're definitely unified, but these little cities and all these different groups and their foundation suddenly has fallen to pieces. And there's nothing they can do about it. It says, "The Lord hath mingled a perverse spirit in the midst thereof." Almost like dizzy. Maybe I would say the Lord hath mingled a dizzying spirit in the midst thereof. So the image is of the spirit coming to sort of make Egypt dizzy. It says, "They have caused Egypt to err in every work thereof, as a drunken man staggereth in his vomit." So Egypt is depicted as kind of this staggering, drunken thing that's, throwing up everywhere and not able to do anything. So once again, Isaiah's definitely making fun of these guys. "Neither shall there be any work for Egypt which the head or tail, branch or rush may do." It's hard to know what to do with this to make heads or tails of it, as it were. But I think what he's saying is that they aren't going to be able to finish anything. They're going to try to do things, but they're never going to be able to do anything from beginning to end, kind of a thing. That seems to be what he's talking about here. The Septuagint seems to indicate that. But it may be that all the standard things that they did with branches and rushes, their standard agricultural products, linen, papyrus, etc., they aren't going to have any of those anymore. So you're going to have all these people out of work because they have literally no agricultural products to do things with. And the Dead Sea Scrolls indicates that actually some of those things that appear to be about fish in the earlier part of the chapter may actually be about this. All their agricultural and textile and everything, all of their industries are just going to be worthless. So that's the picture painted. And here we have what appears to be the third editor. In that day shall Egypt be like unto women. Now remember, when we went through Isaiah and the Book of Mormon, we compared what is one of the elements that seems to be included later on. One of those things seems to be things about women that are maybe a little bit less than complimentary. The Dead Sea Scrolls version of this is even more uncomplimentary. It depicts Egypt as a battered wife and Jehovah as the husband. Obviously, that's not right. And so, considering this guy's MO, I would say that's probably something that we're looking at here is this third editor once again doing what he does. Interesting that a little bit of misogynistic tendency for him, but that has appeared to be what's going on. So, but once again, we remember what this guy does. He doesn't add in huge chunks all the time necessarily. It's a phrase here and a phrase there. So between the Dead Sea Scrolls and knowing this third editor's MO, I would maybe say something like, in that day, not shall Egypt be like unto woman. I'd say, in that day, the Egyptians will tremble and be afraid at the uplifted hand of the Lord of hosts when he shakes his hand against them. So instead of sort of this image of this abused spouse, sort of the idea of Jehovah sort of getting ready to smite Egypt, and they will realize that Jehovah is about to smite them, and they're kind of trembling. I think that's more the idea. Once again, some of these edits appear to have been fairly early, so the Dead Sea Scrolls doesn't actually fix a lot of these edits, and so neither does the Septuagint. So it's hard to know, but based on this guy's sort of MO, that does appear to be what we're looking at here. So it says, and the land of Judah shall be a terror unto Egypt. Everyone that maketh mention thereof shall be afraid in himself, because of the counsel of the Lord of hosts, which he hath determined against it. So the Lord of hosts, once again, keeps using Lord of hosts, which means he who causes armies to be. Probably that's what that full sentence would mean. He who causes armies to be, or Lord of armies, definitely that idea. And so people are just thinking about Judah and Judah's God is going to make all the people in Egypt be sort of shaking in their boots. Everyone that even says the name Judah, they'll be afraid, right? So, once again, it's kind of funny here. Because of the counsel of the Lord of hosts, which he hath determined against it, because they know that the Lord of hosts is coming for them, and that he's going to beat up on them. And so they're just terrified of this idea. They can't even stand to think about Judah and Judah's God. But then we get, once again, Isaiah signals us with the phrase, in that day. Isaiah can indeed be accused of sort of bouncing around a lot, but often he is talking about things in his own time, even when he's talking about things in another time. But very, very often when he says, in that day, I think we really are talking eschatological, sort of the end of days. Sometimes it is directly related to what just happened, but a lot of times it seems to me to be eschatological. And I think that's what we see here. So, in that day, shall 5 cities in the land of Egypt speak the language of Canaan, and swear to the Lord of hosts. One shall be called the city of destruction. In that day shall there be an altar to the Lord in the midst of the land of Egypt, and a pillar at the border thereof to the Lord. And it shall be for a sign and for a witness unto the Lord of hosts in the land of Egypt, for they shall cry unto the Lord because of the oppressors, and he shall send them a Saviour and a great one, and he shall deliver them. And the Lord shall be known to Egypt, and the Egyptians shall know the Lord in that day, and shall do sacrifice and oblation, yea, they shall vow a vow unto the Lord, and perform it. And the Lord shall smite Egypt, he shall smite and heal it, and they shall return even to the Lord, and he shall be entreated of them, and shall heal them. In that day shall there be a highway out of Egypt to Assyria, and the Assyrian shall come into Egypt, and the Egypt into Assyria, and the Egyptians shall serve with the Assyrians. In that day shall Israel be the third with Egypt, and with Assyria, even a blessing in the midst of the land, whom the Lord of hosts shall bless, saying, Blessed be Egypt my people, and Assyria the work of my hands, and Israel mine inheritance. So here in this chapter, this part of the chapter, we get something that, like I said, I think it definitely is eschatological. So in that day shall 5 cities in the land of Egypt speak the language of Canaan. That seems kind of odd. 5 cities. You can't help but wonder which 5 cities maybe. And it's hard to say. But he could be talking about the northernmost region of Egypt, and maybe a big part of the territory that the Israelites were in originally before they got taken out of Egypt. That's a possibility. But it seems like it might be new cities, and that insight comes from the Septuagint translation, which says, in that day there will be 5 cities in the land of Egypt that speak the language of Canaan. So very clearly, yeah, they're in Egypt, but basically they're an annex, a wider southwestern annex of the kingdom of Israel, basically, and swear to the Lord of hosts. So there's going to be this part of Egypt that it basically is just part of Israel. They speak, Hebrew. They swear to the Lord of hosts. They acknowledge Jehovah as their God. And it says, and one shall be called the city of destruction. But then in another version, it's called the city of the sun. And then in another version, and note, this really is, I think, Isaiah really, what he's really doing is something that would have been very, very upsetting to most of these people. And so most people are like, really, Isaiah, did you really just go there? And so they edit this. But the Septuagint guys, I think, sometimes they don't pick up on things, and so they will do things that at first seem like mistakes, and then you realize, no, they actually preserve the original reading. So it says in the Septuagint, specifically, that they will build this place, and then it gives a strange name. It does, because in one it's the city of the sun, in another one it's the city of destruction. And you're like, okay, that's fine, that makes sense. But then you look at the Septuagint, and they seem to just have taken a word that was there in Hebrew and just written it straight into Greek, and the word is azetic. Now that is the Hebrew for, so one will be called Azetic city. Now that is the word for the righteous. So that would be translated, the one city will be called the righteous city, or the Zedek city. That word is the word that Jerusalem was known by for a while. Melchizedek, king of righteousness, was the king of Jerusalem for a long time, right? And so that having this city in Egypt, but it's associated with Jerusalem, and it's called Zedek, that would have been totally crazy to this audience. And their idea of nationalism, it was very, very upsetting to have a city that was basically like Jerusalem. So basically you have a Jerusalem in Egypt. That was really, really upsetting to that audience. And so it seems that they changed that to get out of that. But in the Septuagint, we have just the transliterated version. They took the Hebrew word and they wrote it out in Greek letters. So that's one case where thankfully they may not have known what was going on, and so they just copied what they had, and so that we're actually getting probably a good version of what that should be. So that's a very, very bold thing for Isaiah to say. One will be called the city of righteousness, just like Jerusalem. In that day shall there be an altar to the Lord in the midst of the land of Egypt, and a pillar at the border thereof to the Lord. Once again, this idea of the center of worship, not in the land of Israel, but in Egypt. The Egyptians are going to be worshiping the Lord. This would have been totally, like I said, totally foreign to Isaiah's audience. We also get this in some ways happens at a place called Elephantine, not sure how to pronounce that exactly, in Egypt. There were a bunch of people who went down there, a Jewish community, and it became a fairly large Jewish community, and there was indeed a temple of some sort there with an altar and all that stuff. So it's interesting that this would happen, and I think Isaiah is maybe seeing something else here, but it's interesting that that would happen on a kind of a preliminary level, even in the ancient world. I think this is during the Persian period. And once again, we need to know one of the things he's talking about: a pillar at the border thereof to the Lord. He has talked about these periodically. These are the things I mentioned called matzavot. They're these big stone pillars. Sometimes in the Old Testament they're good, like here, pillar at the border thereof to the Lord. There doesn't seem to be a problem with it. The patriarchs use these. There doesn't seem to be a problem with it. But during certain periods, they are associated with idolatry. And so instead of trying to figure out which ones are good and which ones are bad, some leaders have just said, meh, just get rid of them all. Okay, but Isaiah is seeing a time when that's not going to be the case. You will indeed have these things, and they'll be to the Lord. In 20 it says that these things, the altar and the pillar, will be for a sign and a witness unto the Lord of hosts in the land of Egypt. For they shall cry unto the Lord because of the oppressors, and he shall send them a Savior and a great one, and he shall deliver them. So Egypt is going to be doing so badly that God will send someone to save them. Now, if you want to read this from a Christological point of view, since he does seem to be talking about some future day, this historically, as far as we know, this doesn't happen in Isaiah's immediate time period, as far as I can tell. In some ways, the Assyrians coming in can be seen as deliverance, I guess, from the Nubians, but not really. Right, and you might say the same about the Babylonians or the Persians, but I'm not necessarily convinced about that. So yes, politically, this kind of thing could happen, but not in conjunction with having an altar to the Lord in the midst of the land of Egypt necessarily, and a pillar at the border. You could see this as being, something that happens in the Persian period. The temple is there in the Persian period with the altar, and the Persians do give them a little bit more free reign than the Babylonians, and actually they help them write a law code in much the same way that they may have approved the wider distribution and editing of the law of Moses during the time of Ezra, it seems. But it does seem that there's something else in play here. It should be noted that some of the first places, the first two places really, outside of sort of the immediate Holy Land area and sort of Paul's area, that converted to Christianity in a really, really big way, excuse me, entire countries converted to Christianity, were Egypt and Armenia. So it's interesting that it would say that they shall cry unto the Lord because of the oppressors, and he shall send them a Savior and a great one, and he shall deliver them. Once again, if Egypt as we see, is one of the first countries to convert to Christianity, that may have something of a Christological fulfillment, if you ask me. And the Lord shall be known to Egypt, and the Egyptians shall know the Lord in that day, and shall do sacrifice and oblation. Yea, they shall vow a vow unto the Lord, and perform it. Very, very clear temple imagery here in Egypt. Like I said, this is totally foreign at the time. This idea of including Egypt or Israel's enemies, really. Israel's old oppressors, as worshiping the Lord, would have been very surprising. And the Lord shall smite Egypt, he shall smite and heal it, and they shall return even to the Lord, and he shall be entreated of them, and shall heal them. So yes, the Lord is going to smite Egypt, but then he will heal them, and they will come back to him, and he will listen to them when they call to him, and he'll heal them. Um, this would have been totally foreign. I can't stress that enough. How strange this would have seemed to Isaiah's audience. These people are sort of circling the wagons against these other nations, but Isaiah says, no, it's not about what nationality you are. If these people worship the Lord, there's nothing wrong with them. And God will humble them so that they turn to him, so that they do worship the Lord. He sees the world as sort of one big happy family under Jehovah. And I think that's a beautiful image. 23, it says, in that day shall there be a highway out of Egypt to Assyria, and the Assyrian shall come into Egypt, and the Egyptian into Assyria, and the Egyptians shall serve with the Assyrians. These nations absolutely hate each other. The Nubians were some of the only people that were ever able to stand toe to toe with the Assyrians. Eventually they did get taken out by the Assyrians, but they gave them a run for their money. And so to have these nations that are absolutely at odds with each other come together would have been totally crazy in Isaiah's time. That's what he's saying is going to happen. In that day shall Israel be the third with Egypt and with Assyria, even a blessing in the midst of the land. So Israel and Egypt and Assyria are all going to be one big happy family. And it says, whom the Lord of hosts shall bless. So they will be a blessing, and the Lord will bless them, saying, blessed be Egypt my people, and Assyria the work of mine hands, and Israel mine inheritance. So all of these people are sort of going to be adopted by God, basically adopted into the house of Israel. Really, I only know of one time where that's really going to happen, and that's this dispensation. We're looking at that right now as we go and do our work in the world to try to bring people around. And obviously we don't, we're not able to be in the Middle East in a big way right now. But eventually, apparently, that will be the case. So once again, this is a short oracle. The whole kind of a long chapter, but the whole Egyptian oracle is contained in just this chapter. There is some mention of Egypt in the next chapter, but it seems to be at a different time and place. So, Isaiah, this oracle says, God is going to make some bad things happen to the Egyptians. The Nubians are going to come. The global situation is going to be bad as far as the climate, and it's going to be a rough time. But eventually, things like this, as they continue to happen, will cause them to repent, and they will come around. And the Middle East is going to be one big happy family under Jehovah. That seems so crazy, even as it's coming out of my mouth. That seems insane to me. But this is what we see. This is what Isaiah is saying. It would have seemed just as crazy at the time. But I think that we're going to see this. I think that we will eventually see this happen. So anyway, that's chapter 19. Next time, like I said, we just have a little bit more about Egypt, and then we'll be moving on to some other things. So we will see you guys next time.